Friends, welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session. So usually we talk about something in the letter, and this week I'm actually going to talk about last week's letter, but I did reference it in the beginning of this week's episode on the podcast. And I mentioned how the patient has just come through a trough period and was experiencing a slow fade decline. But Screwtape mentions how the patient is in a very dangerous spot. And so what he meant by this was the patient's come to a point where he's depending on the daily, hourly bread. And that's what's really dangerous. There's a humility. There's no longer these grand statements that I'm going to conquer this vice and become this incredibly virtuous person. I'm going to white knuckle this and I'm going to put all this in place. And instead, he's just like, you know what? I need to just get through today, and I need your grace, Heavenly Father. And I wanted to talk about this because, one, I have discussed in detail on the podcast in this season, being in a trough period myself, and spiritual practices, physical practices as well, with diet, exercise, healthy routines, healthy spiritual routines, really struggling throughout the pandemic. And I've made these grand sweeping statements to myself that I'm just going to get right back to where I was. And that's very natural, but it actually can lead to a lot of disappointment because in my experience, it hasn't actually happened. I have made lots of strides and improvements, and the last few months have been a blessing, but it's not been an easy road. And so what I wanted to talk about here was how do we get to that place? And the importance of getting to that place and the lessons we learn from the trough period. And so I was asking myself so much on the podcast, what is God trying to teach me in this period right now? Why am I going through this? What am I here to learn? And it was interesting. This past weekend, I was at Mass and I went to confession and just talked about some of my struggles with the priest. And it was one where it was not during the normal time. So I had a chance to really dive deep with him. And he reminded me of my humanity. And he said, what it seems like you are learning in this period is how much you need God on a daily basis, how human you are, how white knuckling it, which is so me. I always just assume I can white knuckle anything, is not the way to go. It's how much I need God to get these things done. Because I remember early on in my spiritual journey, there were a number of vices from pre-Christianity, if you want to call it that, pre-conversion, that were sins and things that I needed to cut from my life. And honestly, I was able to do it. And I probably developed a little bit of pride, and I assumed I did it myself. And I didn't realize how much I was dependent on God's grace. And what I have learned through this trough period is the need for that daily and hourly bread. Coming from the Catholic tradition, that's also very literal statement in receiving that daily bread through daily mass and the importance of that in my own journey, in specifically the grace of Jesus Christ through the Eucharist, receiving him into me in a very tangible way. A daily rosary is another practice that I have found that I really need with this, and to take these issues to prayer specifically. And so I can relate to the patient. I don't want to claim and pretend that I am there in this dangerous spot where I recognize fully my need. I still have some of that arrogance and pride and that belief that how come I can't do this, or I should be able to do this. It's me. I'm a disciplined human being, above average discipline. There's still more that I think God's working on breaking from me. But I wanted to just bring that message here today in this Skype session. For anyone listening to this, if you are like myself and maybe you're in a trough period, maybe you're trying to get back to some habits and disciplines that you've had, remember that maybe God's putting you to this period because he does desire you to get back there, but he desires you to do it really dependent on him. So asking yourself, what types of spiritual practices can you implement in your life that foster that grace, foster that disposition towards him and a need to him, and that daily and hourly grace. So I hope that message was encouraging. I hope that was helpful to anyone who's listening to this. God bless all of you, and thank you for watching.